we want to acknowledge that we come tonight from Wurundjeri country, land that was never ceded, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Hi everyone, I'm Elissa Goldstein. Welcome to the Melbourne Jewish Book Week's Summer Reading Guide session for 2021. I'm Elissa Goldstein. Just a little bit about me. I'm in Melbourne, where I was born and raised. I currently work at the ABC as a digital producer. And prior to that, I've worked for other digital media publications, and I lived in New York for several years, and I have an MFA in creative writing. So I spent a couple of years reading and writing. And I'm a big reader. I'm here in my capacity tonight as a reader. I'll introduce our other two panellists. Bram, who you also may remember from last year, is a semi-reformed punk rocker, recovering academic, lapsed criminal lawyer, and two-time cartoon character. His debut novel, The Book of Dirt, was released to great acclaim and won the National Jewish Book Award for debut fiction in the US, and lots of other literary prizes in Australia, too numerous to name here. And most recently, he was on the judging panel for the fiction category of the 2022 Victorian Premier's Literary Award. And our third panellist is Tali Lavi, who is a writer, critic, public interviewer and programmer for Melbourne Jewish Book Week. Welcome, Bram and Tali. Nice to see you again.
Hey, how are you?
Hello.
Good to be back.
Good.
Having not spoken to you for an entire year.
But we've really aged decades.
Yeah.
No, we haven't. Speak for yourself.
It's been another year of interesting reading. Didn't think we'd have another full year of pandemic, I have to say. But
No. But I just found that this year reading was less affected in the early stages, and then when we got to the last lockdown, I hit the reading wall. It was weird again. But once again, I think books saved me, and so that's always a good thing.
Yeah. I just want to give a shout out to my book club that kept me reading at least one book a month when I struggled otherwise. Yeah. Anyway, let's just get started. Let's get into it. We've got lots of books to cover tonight to talk about in different categories to the ones last year, so it'll feel a bit different. And we're going to start each by sharing one book that we just really loved this year that blew us away. Tali, do you want to kick us off with the book that blew you away in 2021?
Yes, and I'd just first like to note that I'm conscious that both Elissa and Bram talk twice as fast as me. So they have graciously agreed to let me go for twice as long, and this speaks to our deep friendship. I also want to talk about the book that blew me away is Memories of the Future, one of the literary thrills of the year. Yes, strangely, in 2021, there was still the prospect of experiencing some forms of delight, was revisiting the work and reading the new essay collection of novelist, intellectual and philosopher Siri Hustvedt. Sorry, and I do know how to pronounce her name, but now that I am on screen, I have mispronounced it. So it's Siri Hustvedt, I now know. And I was fortunate enough to interview her last week. Memories of the Future was published in 2019 and is a capacious novel. Siri Hustvedt's oeuvre builds on itself, which is not to say that it was originally undeveloped, because many people will be familiar with one of her earlier and much adored novels, What I Loved. Like one other of her novels, and yet radically different to them, Memories of the Future traverses terrains of creativity, of possibilities for transformation, of multiple selves, the history of female elision, and the radically distinct landscapes of her origin state, rural Minnesota, and her adopted home, New York City. Time is malleable, memory is unstable. Memories of the Future encompasses the conversation between two selves, the young self and the mature one. And the writer also lectures in psychiatry. So besides from the poetics of her prose, there is a boundless depth to her work, to the complexity of human nature. And because this is a Melbourne Jewish Book Week conversation, I will state for the public record that Siri Hustvedt has created some of my most favourite of Jewish literary characters.
Lovely. Thanks, Tali. Bram.
Yeah, so the book that blew me away is actually a surprisingly very short one. And it's this Assembly by Natasha Brown. It's a little book that packs just a massive punch. It's really the freshest, most exciting contemporary that I think I've read about race and class. It's completely accessible. It's compelling. It's enjoyable. It's powerful. It's just over 100 pages. And it centers around an unnamed narrator she's a black woman in England. She seemingly has it all. She's got this, high-flying job. She's just got a big promotion. She has this dream white boyfriend, and she's kind of got this seeming acceptance into the kind of stuffy upper crust world of British society. And she basically gets an invite to her boyfriend's parents' kind of country club lunch, essentially. And it's going to be the kind of the pinnacle of acceptance into that world. At the same time, she's diagnosed with cancer and decides not to have it treated. And this book is a disruptive bomb that's placed under the assumptions and accepted norms of modern British society. She really, Natasha Brown, and I can't believe this is a debut. She brilliantly depicts how racism, in both its kind of overt and its more kind of perfidiously subtle manifestations, impacts on the narrator's life. This book, it's infuriating, it's exhilarating, it's just wow. I love it so much. It absolutely blew me away, and I would have to say it's one of the best debuts I've read in years.
It's a visceral punch, isn't it?
It is it literally kind of left me spent. It beat me down, but not in a bad way. I don't want to scare people away from it, because it's a fantastic read, but it's really, it just does something. And there aren't many books that you can say do something. Which leaves you, Elissa.
So my book that blew me away is The Promise by Damon Gallagher, which I think you guys have also both read. This won the Booker Prize, and very deservedly so. He's quite prolific, Gallagher, but this is my first book of his that I've ever read, and it totally blew me away. So I'll just sort of give you a rundown of the premise. This book follows the fate of a white family in South Africa as the country is kind of at the end of apartheid and transitioning out of it, and then emerging out of apartheid. It begins in the 80s with the death of the matriarch, Rachel, who's relatively young when she dies. She's 40. She has 3 children. She's a Jewish woman, and her husband is Afrikaans. And the drama of the novel kind of pivots around this titular promise that is made to give the black housekeeper, who has worked for the family for many years, the house that she lives on the property. And what happens to this promise, which is, this is not a spoiler. Well, I won't tell you what happens with the promise, but the drama of the novel kind of pivots on that kicks it off, and we see what happens to this family over the course of 40 years. There are 3 children. They're all quite different. We follow their lives as their lives unfold, but mostly from the perspective of the youngest child, Amor. And basically, I think that this book is so profoundly profound because it is a book that is about really heavy stuff: apartheid, the legacy of racism, masculinity, and how it is not just bad for women, but it's bad for men, about the way religion can kind of be co-opted for nefarious means. It feels grim and heavy at times, but it's also a book with a lot of humor, and it has these moments of lightness. The narrative is very experimental and agile. You're never just in one person's perspective. There are different sections sort of that focus on different characters, but within one sentence or one paragraph, you can flit from one point of view to another, sometimes in the same sentence. It's the kind of thing that doesn't actually, it shouldn't work. And if someone described the novel to me before I read it, I would think that doesn't work, but it does. It's totally masterful. Like, I've never read a book with so many point of view changes, where you can be very close to a character, then very distant from them. And yet I was just riveted by it the whole time. You also get a really interesting kind of tour through South African history. It engages really deeply with politics, but it's not a political book with a capital P. It doesn't feel like it's teaching you a lesson or it's being sanctimonious. It just feels like it's very reflective of what it was to live in South Africa during that time. And it does have a Jewish angle with this Jewish character. It's subtle, but I will just say I don't think it's a coincidence that the author is Jewish and that the matriarch is Jewish, and that it is her kind of moral conscience that kicks off the promise that then kicks off the narrative of this family. So that's my rave. It's great.
It's amazing.
Give it a read.
It's just brilliant. I'm with you. It was one of the best books of the year, easily. And it's, you know, every year when the Booker Prize comes out, you see the list and you think, oh, you know, some book that's, you know, some compromise is going to win. And this year actually had a really great shortlist. But like, as soon as I read the Gallagher, I'm like, if this does not win, I mean, he's always been like the Booker Bridesmaid, but he's been kind of building up to this book, and it's magnificent. And like, yeah, absolutely brilliant choice.
Yeah, and it's just we do need to move on to the next section.
Yes.
But I will say there's a great interview with him on Radio National. I'll send by the way, everything we talk about tonight, it's going to come to you in an email, all the titles, all the links, so you can relax. You don't need to worry about writing it down. We're going to send it all to you. But there's a great interview.
Put down your pens.
There's a great interview with him on, I think, The Bookshelf, one of the ABCs, one of RN's book shows, and he talks about the genesis of the book and his political awakening over the course of his writing career, and it's really fascinating. Anyway, on to the next section. We've all read one book and we're all going to discuss it. Last year it was Nicole Krauss. This year it is David Grossman, More Than I Love My Life.
Yeah.
Beautiful cover.
It really is.
It is.
Simple, but like stunning. I vote one of you two to tell what it's about.
Elissa, you go.
It's impossible.
Okay, all right. Do you know what? I'm actually I'm going to read the blurb on the back.
Yeah.
It's a good summary. On a kibbutz in Israel in 2008, Gilly is celebrating the 90th birthday of her grandmother Vera, the adored matriarch of a sprawling and tight-knit family. But festivities are interrupted by the arrival of Nina, the iron-willed daughter who rejected Vera's care, and the absent mother who abandoned Gilly when she was a baby. Nina's return to the family after years of silence precipitates an epic journey from Israel to the desolate island of Goliotok, part of the former Yugoslavia. It was here 5 decades earlier that Vera was held and tortured as a political prisoner, and it is here that the three women will finally come to terms with the terrible moral dilemma that Vera faced and that permanently altered the course of their lives.
Yeah, it's a good description. What did you think? I loved it. I think it was just so beautiful. You know when you read all I've just read a lot of books recently, and then you come across a book where it's just a master at the top of their game, and Grossman, like, I didn't love his last book, The Horse Walks Into a Bar, but this is just sublime. This is a great story about intergenerational trauma and just like motherhood and family and connection, and it also gave an insight. Like, I'm so used to reading intergenerational trauma about the Holocaust, but to see it now put in it's in Croatia, I think. Under Tito's Yugoslavia. And just kind of seeing the depiction of the camp life there is horrific, but also just understanding like these horrific, the moral dilemma that is spoken about in the blurb is just like it tears you apart. It's like a Sophie's Choice type thing, but like not like in some ways worse. Yeah, it was like, I don't want to go into spoiler territory, but it's just incredible.
So I think you're right, Bram, in terms of the way Grossman understands in his bones what it is to suffer from intergenerational trauma, and he's written about it before, but here he's actually inspired. Vera is inspired by a real story of a woman who he befriended quite some time ago. She just died recently. Her name was Eva Panik, and I'm going to get that wrong in terms of or something. And she was a bit of a heroine in terms of that national history and the way that she withstood this torture. But it's interesting, I feel like the trauma works on two levels here, and there's a clue in it, I think, in terms of the title of the novel. So one is the English one, which is More Than I Love My Life. And I have to say, it has been so beautifully translated by Jessica Cohen, who is just amazing.
Amazing.
But the original Hebrew title is actually Iti HaChaim Mesachek Harbe, which kind of roughly translates as with me, life plays a lot. So it's terrible translation. That's why I'm not a translator.
But it is the literal translation, to be fair.
It's a literal translation. And so what I think that the real original title contains kind of the bitter realism of existence that's not in the other title. And it's almost the sense of agency is reasserted in the English title. And there's two kind of fractures going on. There's one which speaks of the fallout of a grand love, a kind of tempestuous love. And then the other fallout is what happens when world forces kind of fracture you.
I think the Hebrew title, I was really intrigued by the tone of the Hebrew title compared to the English translation. And I also think that the Hebrew title plays on the playfulness in the book, because I think from how we're describing it, it sounds super grim and depressing, and there are certainly those moments, but it is also very funny. Like there were lots of moments where I laughed out loud. Like Vera, who is the grandmother and the patriarch, is a really comedic character, and even in the various interpersonal relationships between, you've got these three generations, the grandmother, the mother, and the granddaughter. There are these funny moments between all of them, and these moments of misunderstanding. There's like jokes about sex, and there's, I don't know, there's just real, like, it's very hard to read a story that is a narrative about trauma and survival of persecution. And there are so many ways to approach it, but what I love about Grossman is that he takes you to the edge of thinking, I can't tolerate more of this. And then he'll quickly shift the scene to something else. You'll travel back in time, or you'll jump to the present. You'll get a different kind of dialogue. It's actually quite, like, I actually thought it was quite experimental. Lots of it, well, not experimental is too strong a word, but it is playful. There's a lot of dialogue. There's a lot of jumping backwards and forwards in time. Like, there isn't a ton of narration. We learn what happens through the people, through the words that come out of their mouths, which are subjective and often unreliable, or each character has an agenda or their own kind of personal broigus that they bring to this broader family dynamic. And that can be very tragic at times, but also funny. Do you know what I mean? Like, that kind of kept me going, even though I found it quite harrowing at times.
Yeah, I laughed. I definitely laughed at times. The framing device is weird, though. I wasn't quite sure of it, like, because it's done in this way where essentially they're making a film for the middle generation, the Vera's daughter / Gilly's mother, who is beginning to lose her memory, and there's this thing that they're going to have this movie that they'll be able to play her once her memory's lost, so they can retell her life and who she is and understand who she is. And it was a very strange framing device. And Gilly was I don't know, was sort of a bit of a nothing voice. Like I feel bad saying that, but maybe that's okay. Maybe she was, you know, her existence was to draw forth the story. But that said, you know, as you say, it had a very light touch at times for a book that was so dark, and so, you know, it was able to give you breathing space and have a good laugh in some, you know, horrific places.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry.
I was just going to say, I didn't always find the narrative device successful. I thought his skill as a writer when it comes to sentences, dialogue, and moments that move you is really profound, and that carries it. But there were times when I felt the strain of the film within the book and the many stories within the stories. You're always being told a story, and it's kind of delicious, but there's shifting back and forth, and there were times when I wanted it to be a little bit tighter.
So I think in terms of the narrator with Gilly, who is who interestingly enough, Gilly again, if you and there is a note in the translation, when you translate the name, it is both my joy, but it's also a kind of rejoinder to rejoice. So it is, she's an interesting narrator in terms of she is faltering, as you said, Bram, but I think this is done on purpose. She's really had to kind of exist in the margins. She's been swept to the side. She's interestingly a continuity editor in film, so she's a really sharp observer, and that's her place here, is to often hold the adults together, even though she is not that strong herself, because love has been withdrawn from her. And I wondered if, you know, Nina is expressionless. There is much made of her being expressionless, having this beautiful face, and that's like a siren, but she's also just devoid of an expression. And I wondered whether this is like a defiance of memory, a repression to the point of oblivion. That's what was kind of going in my head.
I think we have to move on to our next.
But definitely read it. Like it's one of the, like I think we would all heartily recommend it. It's a beautiful book. It will draw you in. It's quite a gentle, slow read as well. Like you will savor reading it.
Yeah. Also, I just want to, we're moving on to the next thing, but I want to sneak in one more comment, which is just that I think David Grossman writes women very well.
Yes.
And
totally.
for a man who, I just think he's very good. And there are moments with other male writers where I'm like, but with him, it feels very natural to me. Anyway.
Just before you go, on that note, because, he's written about that in his, there's a book of essays on writing that you should all look up, and I'll shoot through a link or something, but he writes about, you know, the kind of transitioning of being a writer, which is interesting. Go.
Cool. All right. So our next segment is one that Bram thought up. It's called Big Book, Little Book. And we're each going to share one very big book that we've read this year and a little book. Bram, do you want to go first?
Sure. So my big book is the big book of the season. It's the publishing event, I think, of 2021. And it is The Books of Jacob by Nobel Prize winner Olga Tokarczuk. It is a big book. It is 960 something pages. And it was cited by the Nobel Committee as Tokarczuk's magnum opus when they gave her the award. And it has been translated with absolutely incredible skill and flair by Jennifer Croft, and an amazing feat of translation. I think it took her 7 years or something. I'm going to go straight out and say that I think this is the best Jewish novel of the past 20 years, and Tokarczuk is not Jewish. It's the story of the false messiah Jacob Frank, who some people may know, not personally, I'm hoping, told from the various perspectives of those who knew, loved, followed, hated, doubted, fought with him, and also one kind of ghost trapped in some sort of existential limbo. For those who don't know about Frank, he appeared in the wake of Shabtai Tzvi's messianic episode in the kind of medieval kind of times. He garnered a huge following as a counterfigure to the traditional Talmudic Jewish followers. And ultimately he converted to Christianity along with a whole lot of his followers. As I said, very big book, a book of great ideas with an incredible grasp of Jewish culture, history, and literature. I dare say there are people who have devoted their lives to, learning all things Jewish who would not have a grasp even approaching Tokarczuk's in this book. And while it's like it's very readable, and it's a fascinating historical novel, but it also deals with really important contemporary themes, like things like the porousness of identity, clashes within and between faith groups, the dangerous draw of a charismatic leader, the timeless problem of anti-Semitism, and what the book really is about: language, meaning, understanding, communication. It's a magnificent book. Strongly recommend it. It will take you all summer. My little book, on the other hand, is this gorgeous gem of a book, The Most Precious of Cargoes by Jean-Claude Grumberg. And it is a fable in the really old world sense. It's the story of a woodman and his wife who live in a small village somewhere in Europe. They dream of having a child. The woodman's wife dreams of having a child, but they're unable to conceive. We're familiar with their, kind of this sadness that she carries. It cuts to a Jewish family being put on a train to being sent to a concentration camp, and they've got twins. And on the journey, the mother is unable to feed both twins, and so the father makes the decision to wrap one of the children in a towel and throw it out into the forest as they're traveling towards the concentration camp, and it is found by the woodsman's wife. And then it goes between these two counter stories, one of the woodsman and his wife raising this baby as the kind of clouds of war descend on their area of Europe, and the story of the father as he tries to survive the concentration camp. And look, it is just stunning. I cried through this book. It's so beautiful, so heartwarming, just so brilliantly rendered in that classical style that you'll just instantly it's like getting a hug from a book. And it's harrowing, it's sweet, but it's got flashes of humor. It's a very enjoyable read. I think it's a masterpiece in miniature. I cannot recommend it highly enough. Again, all the books we're talking about today, we're talking about them because we recommend them. But yes, The Most Precious of Cargoes by Jean-Claude Grumberg.
I'll go next. Just getting my notes and checking the time. Yep, we're doing okay. Okay, so I'll start with my little book, actually, which is, I've had a last minute change of heart. So Tali, you'll be pleased. It's a children's book. It's a book for anyone, people who are young at heart. It's called Osnat and Her Dove by Sigal Samuel, who's a young writer. She's Canadian, lives in the United States. She's from, I believe, an Iraqi Jewish family. And this is just such a gorgeous picture book. It is, let me just go to my notes so I can read coherently to you. It is based on the true story of the first woman who became a rabbi. Osnat was born in Mosul in modern-day Iraq in 1590. She was the daughter of a great scholar and yeshiva leader. She was a girl who was very curious about Judaism and about reading, about Torah, Mishnah, Talmud, and basically insisted that her father teach her, even though she was not a boy. And she became very learned, married a very learned man who agreed to marry her because she insisted in the ketubah that she not be required to do housework so that she could learn Torah. He agreed to that. They got married. And then I read in my research of reading about the book and some interviews that I think that there's a story that Hashem only gave her 2 children so that she wouldn't be too burdened by the responsibilities of motherhood and she'd be able to spend time learning and teaching Torah, which is just I kind of love that, that little story. And it's just gorgeous. The illustrations are beautiful. They're by an illustrator called Vali Mincy, who studied at Bezalel in Jerusalem. And they're just these lovely watercolors, full of color, The story is really simply told, but it's really beautiful. See, that's learning in the yeshiva. Just gorgeous. Fight for the children in your life, but people young and old as well. And also Sigal is a really great journalist. She writes for adults as a journalist, that's her day job, and but has really interesting things to say about her Iraqi identity. She's also written a novel for adults that is called The Mystics of Mile End, which is terrific and is about mysticism, Kabbalah, Judaism, Montreal Jews, so recommend. And my big book, which I will just touch on briefly, is Far from the Tree by Andrew Solomon, which I have been reading, I kid you not, for like 7 years. On and off. It's an amazing book. He's a non-fiction writer, journalist. You may have read his work in the New York Times and the New Yorker, but he, in this massive volume, writes about, this book is about how families accommodate children with physical, mental, and social disabilities and differences. So basically, it's about what happens when parents have children whose identities fall outside their own, which is what he describes as a child's horizontal identity as opposed to a vertical identity. The chapters are very long, very in-depth. He does a lot of interviews and spends a lot of time with families. So looks at a family with a child who is deaf, a child who's transgender, parents of children who commit crimes. It can get pretty intense and heavy, but it's beautifully written. You're always led by his compassion and his curiosity. It's never reductive. He doesn't have a point or a message. He just wants to get to know people and what helps people parent in difficult situations. So I'm not a parent, but it certainly makes me think differently about parents and my parents and what it means to be a parent. And I'm sure if you're a parent, it will make you think very differently about raising children. So highly recommend it. Won lots of awards in like 2012. I'll finish it maybe by next year.
Yes, Elissa has undertaken that as a pledge to us. Okay, my big book is not so big physically, although I think it's just under 300 pages, no, just under 400 pages. But one of the joys of book Twitter has resided in its book recommendations. So when bookseller M in the East, otherwise known as M from Neighbourhood Books, offered to recommend books based on ones people had read and loved, I immediately responded. One of the books she recommended was one that was already sitting on my wavering bedside table book tower. And it was this, The Staggering Beauty of Unquiet by Lynne, Allman. If I could speak about this book, I could do so for a long time, but Bram and Elissa would unfriend me, both physically and on the socials. Unquiet is a meditation on memory, on time, on silence, on family, on identity, on art and being an artist, on beauty, on grief, on place. Lynne Allman's voice is as mesmeric as her mother, Liv Allman's face was in Ingmar Bergman's movies. Lynne was their love child, and so we loop back to the Grossman novel, as literary conversations often do. Deftly translated by Thilo Reinhard from the Norwegian, this book unleashed something. I'm still working out exactly what it was, almost 6 months on. So thank you, M, for there are many books on that book tower that have not moved place in quite some time. The small book is not so small. I had a thrilling and anxiety-ridden experience of writing a review essay on Cynthia Ozick's new novel, Antiquities, for the forthcoming issue of the Jewish Quarterly. The brief from editor Jonathan Perlman, who has previously appeared in these very Melbourne Jewish Book Week conversations, was to write about Antiquities in the context of her wider work. He might not know till now. If he is listening, hello, and thank you, Jonathan. Cynthia Ozick had been one of those writers I had always meant to read, but up till then, I had only read a certain both excoriating and affecting piece of hers in the New Yorker titled Who Owns Anne Frank? For those unaware of her, she's high in the Jewish literary firmament, an extraordinary novelist, short story writer, and critic who possesses a reputation for being a ferocious intellect. Cynthia Ozick is first-generation American, and she was born in 1928 and still continues to be a formidable presence. And so I read her work, most of it anyway, backwards from Antiquities through to her early short stories, and then returned to this very novel. Antiquities is an idiosyncratic gem, narrated by Lloyd Wilkinson Petrie, who in his 80s lives in a retirement home, along with a few other graduates of the Temple Academy at the former site of their school. Lloyd is waspish in persuasion and in temperament, a fastidious, careful man who finds his life upended by the writing of a memoir from their time at the school, no more than 10 pages undertaken by the remaining resident trustees. Lloyd finds himself haunted by the ghost of his boyish obsession, the Jewish Bension Elephantin, and a plague befalls this slyly titled templed house. The novel is somewhat like the various objects referred to by Lloyd as oddities or arcana, some archaeological, some religious, that Ozick has situated at its heart. The story is alluring, unexpected, and unknowable, as is most of Ozick's other fiction writing. One might come to Antiquities without what has come before it, and to do so is like reading the Bible as narrative without the commentary. It works beautifully, rhythmically on the level of narrative, all is sound, but to read it in light of what has come before it is to be open to its trove of Jewish references. It contains multitudes. Highly recommended.
Okay, so our next section is we're going to be talking about 3 books or literary works that we read this year and loved. I'm just mindful of the time, so I'm going to mention mine briefly. One is that I went on a Lily King kick. I'm obsessed with her. She's an amazing novelist. I read Writers and Lovers, which I adored, which is her newest book. And then I went back and I read Euphoria, which I also adored. If you like Sally Rooney, Laurie Moore, you're going to love her. She's funny, heartfelt. The books are substantial. They deal with grief and sex and identity and writing, but they're also just delicious and easy to read. So Lily King is my new favourite author. Now, the 2 other things that are not books, so we're going to branch out a bit, but they're literary works that I read and loved this year. One was called A Botched Circumcision and Its Aftermath by Gary Steingart, which is a personal essay that he published in the New Yorker. It is about a botched circumcision that he had as an adolescent when he came to the United States from the former Soviet Union, and then how it continues to affect him in adulthood. If you see that I'm sort of smiling, it's a very funny essay. It is also heartbreaking. It is at times painful to read, but it is also laugh out loud funny. It's in the New Yorker. We're going to send you the link. And I really recommend listening to him read it because he reads it in the New Yorker and his narration brings so much humor to these just hilarious and weird and sad appointments with urologists and conversations with his wife and his reflections on what it means to be Jewish and to be a person with a penis. It's very funny. That was very memorable. And my third literary work is this podcast called Once Upon a Time at Bennington College that I relished. I am eating this up right now. I'm about halfway through. It is by a writer who writes for Vanity Fair called Lily Analik, and it explores the few years at Bennington College in the 80s when Donna Tartt, Jonathan Lethem, and Bret Easton Ellis were all students and overlapped, were friends, were sort of lovers, had flirtations. And it is basically, it's like listening to a Vanity Fair article for hours. It's juicy, it's gossipy, it's literary, but it also has real heft. I'm not the biggest Bret Easton Ellis fan, but it's given me a renewed appreciation for who he is and the context in which he was writing. It's really helping me understand 20th century American fiction a lot better. The same with Donna Tartt and Jonathan Lethem, whose writing I both really like. But it's just, you meet them as adolescents, you hear the letters they write to each other, boyfriends, girlfriends, love affairs, drugs taken, wild parties at Bennington. This is like your juicy beach read, but it's in your ears. And Annalik, who is the writer and producer, is a great storyteller and kind of is a great narrator, and it becomes an almost peripheral character in terms of her observations and her literary tastes. So it's great, it's juicy, just listen to it, it's a real treat. Bram?
Okay, so I'm going to cheat and start with a book that I actually read at the end of last year, but it's just really stayed with me, and it's suddenly just gotten currency again because of you know how there's that Nicole Kidman movie about biopic of Lucille Ball. So the book is this The Queen of Tuesday by Darren Strauss, and it is the most like enjoyably chutzpahdik fun book I've read in ages. And the conceit is that Darren imagines that his grandfather had an affair with Lucille Ball during her the height of her fame. His grandfather, a guy called Isidore Strauss, and it's just. He evokes the golden era of American TV with such love and gusto, and it's peppered with so many like joyously sly slates of hand and just filled with humor and heart and pathos, and it's just wonderful. Like it's such a cool book, and the weirdest part about it is I at the end I thought, maybe this book's true. I actually asked him. It's not, but he does it so well that I fully believed it. The next book that I want to talk about, another short book, which is The Dry Heart by Natalia Ginsberg. She was an Italian writer, published most of her work in the 40s and 50s, and she sort of was kind of off the radar until like there's been this renewed interest in her, mostly because of the Elena Ferrante books, I think. And so anyway, the Dry Heart is her. I think it's her second, and I think many people consider her best book. And it's the story of a failed marriage that begins and ends with a kind of quite unemotional declaration that she's just shot her husband between the eyes. Right. And it's this story of unattainable love pursued in the face of like overwhelming evidence that the marriage is not going to work from the start. And it's like peppered with humiliation and heartbreak. And it culminates in this extreme act that she does to essentially reclaim her agency and dignity. It's a beautiful book. It's a short book. It's really, it's fantastic. Strong recommend. And then quickly, my last thing is also a podcast, one that I've been really getting into. It's called Beyond the Xero, and it's like a book nerd's delight. It's a guy from Sydney who has managed to build this like community of amazing writers and literary folk who pretty much line up to go on this podcast. And if you just want to listen to great writers talk about books they love, about their own craft, about books that influence them, and just basically chew the fat about just books, like it's so much fun. And it's just like you all these authors who they're just like incredible names. He just did Sergio de la Parva, like it's just like incredible to get someone like that. He did Jasper Ford, David Keenan. Anyway, he's getting higher and higher profile people as more and more flock to it. At the moment, he's running a World Cup of books on Twitter, which is also really funny. So yeah, Beyond the Xero podcast, strongly recommend as a treasure trove for book recommendation. I've found so many books from that podcast.
I just want to second the notion of Natalia Ginsberg being one of the most fabulous writers. So for my three, I find it worthwhile to keep an eye out for Pushkin Press's publishing catalogue. So this is how I came upon this most wunderbar of novels. Now let's see how much I can butcher this title. Käsebier Takes Berlin was written by Gabriele Turgit, the pen name of Elise.
You got the name, you got the title right.
Yeah, I got the title right. And the Gabriele Turgin No, anyway, the novel was first published in 1931 when Turgit was working as a journalist and moving in circles at the heart of Berlin's wild literary scene. Kaiserbibliothek Berlin is set during the intoxicating last days of the Weimar Republic. Its action moves outwards from the newsroom. It is a superb portrayal of the media and politics of the day and voyages into the pernicious effects of capitalism on society. And so it speaks of now and also of us. The drug that everyone desires here is the new. As a social document, it reminds me of the books of Hans Fallada. It is brilliantly, dangerously funny. The dialogue is kind of reminiscent of the whip-smart film comedies of the 1940s. And Meerman, the theatre critic, as problematic as he is one of those characters that hold you fast. Again, we're moving out of books to this. Oh my God, I don't know if you can see it, but I have been dying to see this film, Shiver Baby, and only excessive phrasing seems fitting for over a year now. As of midday today, I can state this work is fucking brilliant. Again, I know dramatic language seems only fitting for this work. As for the mishpucha, the family watching, and the shonda, the scandal that might ensue at me issuing an obscenity in this cultivated space, I apologize, chatati, and once again, this is only appropriate, seeing as one of the many things this film does is sever that sacrosanct notion of the good Jewish girl, which I once was. It's been described as quirky in marketing materials, and I feel the vehement need to start a petition on the use of the word in this context. Shiver Baby is not safe. It is not asinine, it is not quirky, it is a staggering work of political and human art that channels radical feminist artists like Martha Rosler. In this case, Emma Seligman, the debut writer and director, employs a glorious collage of realism, the grotesque, dark humour, atmospherics that include a Jewish version of the Inquisition, cultural taboos, tropes, the age of social media, and mirrors. It's a twist of the kishkas, the gastrointestinal tract, which has a starring role in Ashkenazi culture and features large here, and a simultaneous bruise and elevation of the neshama, the soul. The script is as tight as Joan Rivers' Punim and certainly more masterful. Like Fiddler on the Roof, which is beloved of audiences literally everywhere, Shiver Baby is relatable. Its particularity is its gift, and its intersectionality is not heavily played out. Its feminist, queer, Jewish, young, brilliant self just is. I predict that Emma Seligman will be writing a certain Jewish male writer-director out of the canon. That's I'm going to drop the third one, but just whoever's read Muriel Spark or hasn't read her, read her. The
Love
Girl
her.
Slender Means.
She's amazing.
Just wonderful.
And Brad, were you thrilled to find out she was Jewish?
I was shocked. Not as shocked as I was to find out that Damon Gallagher was just before, but yeah, like I was thrilled that, like, when Tali said she was going to do Spark, I'm like, oh, we've got to try and keep our focus on Jew. And you two were both like, but she's Jewish. I'm like, what? Like,
but it's not that. It's actually not that uncomplicated, and she did convert to Catholicism, and so there is this great article on the Times Literary Supplement called Was Muriel Spark Jewish, which you might
that's cool.
We'll go and look at.
Okay, well, we've got one more category to cover, which is books that we're looking forward to that are coming out, that are forthcoming. I'll go first. So one that I'm really looking forward to is, it's called I'd Like to Say Sorry, But There's No One to Say Sorry To by Nikolai Greenberg. I don't know if either of you had heard about his writing. I first read about him in Jewish Currents last year. He's a Polish photographer and psychologist. So writes in Polish. This has been translated. I believe this is maybe his first book being translated into English for a bigger audience. I'm not 100% sure. But it is a collection of stories, fictional stories that explore the Jewish experience in contemporary Poland. It is very much based on his experience gathering oral histories of Polish Jews. The book has been widely praised in Poland. It's been shortlisted for Poland's top literary prize. And they're basically like little humorous vignettes and short stories. And I'm so excited and curious about this book. And I'm always interested in Jewish fiction that comes from Europe and non-English speaking countries. So I'm really looking forward to that. Also really looking forward to A Play for the End of the World by Jai Chakrabarti. And I have to say here that I know Jai because we studied together in New York. He's an amazing writer. This is his debut novel. It is a novel about the legacy of the Holocaust, about a child survivor of the Holocaust who's now living in New York in the 70s, and who ends up in India. It's very intertextual. It is about it references the Holocaust. It references Rabindranath Tagore. There's a play within the novel aspect. It involves him the protagonist seeking out a childhood friend of his. It's politics in the 70s in India. There's also a love story. It's just got everything in it, and it's informed by, I think, in a lot of ways, Jai's life and experience. And he's a beautiful, lyrical, elegiac writer who puts a lot of research into what he writes, and he's a very exciting new voice. And there's a third book that I love, but I'll save it for the email. But it's the follow-on to The Idiot by Elif Batuman, who I love. And I just thought that was one of my favorite novels about 5 years ago. So she's sort of written a sequel to it. Anyway, Bram, you next.
Okay, I'm gonna pepper this one. So firstly, the book I'm most looking forward to, which comes out in April, is Canzona de Guerra by Dasha, the Croatian author who is, anyone who knows me, is my great obsession. She died a couple of years ago, and this is another classic book of hers that turns her kind of excoriating mind to immigration in the wake of the war, about alienation against prejudice. Classic Dasha. It will be amazing. I already know that. Strauss Books in England are publishing her back catalogue in English, so I'm very excited about that. Secondly, World Shadow. Nir Baram has a new book coming out. I think it's in January. And when I say new book, it's actually one of his earliest books, and it's actually the book that really made his name. It established him as an international star. It's finally coming out in English, and it was hailed worldwide as a masterpiece. I'm very excited to get my hands on it. So that's World Shadow by Nir Baram. And then Found Wanting by Natasha Scholl. A lot of people might know Natasha. She's a local writer, and this is a memoir that looks at rebuilding her life after her partner's death at a very young age, finding meaning in life, finding love again after experiencing grief and trauma in that sort of way. Lots of early raves for it. Apparently, everyone who's read it says it's brilliant. It comes out, I think, in February. And so, yeah, I'm greatly looking forward to that. And then just two books that are out, but I just thought I'd quickly mention them because I do want to read them, and I'll be reading them over summer. There's a new Joshua Ferris, so A Calling for Charlie Barnes, which is apparently his best book yet. Very funny about a schlemiel a guy who writes his father's life story, trying to essentially redeem his father, who's like this huckster schlemiel who gets everything wrong in life. And apparently it's very warm and gorgeous. And on the other sort of end of the spectrum, A Good Winter, which is meant to be a absolutely fantastic psychological thriller. Gigi Fenster, New Zealand writer, she won a big award there which ended up in the publication of this book. All reports are that it is an excellent read and a really kind of disorienting, difficult, and not in a bad way, as in like psychological thriller. Like it completely wrong foots you in like the best possible way. And there is nothing I love more during summer than a good psychological thriller, like a thriller to get me through. So that'll be top of the list for me.
Okay, my books to look forward to are Beautiful Country by Xian Julie Wang. This is a memoir about Xian Julie Wang's childhood as an undocumented American. It was released in the US a few months ago, made New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and is in NPR Best Book of the Year. The writer is a graduate of Yale Law School and a civil rights lawyer who converted to Judaism as an adult and is an advocate for American Jews of colour. It is said that she has mastered the child's voice. Australiana by Yumna Kassab. This is not what it looks like, but I do have a copy, advanced copy, which I'm very excited about. You may very well have read Sydney writer Yumna Kassab's The House of Yusuf, her highly acclaimed short story collection, which spoke of the Lebanese migrant experience. It is one of those books that tug on my literary psyche with that familiar refrain, "Why haven't you read me yet?" I recently read an essay of hers in the Sydney Review of Books, and it was marvellous. Australiana is due to be released in March next year and is a story about a small town in Australia. Yumna feels to be one of the handful of writers I would want to read on this theme. Golem Girl, a memoir by Riva Lera. The first I read about this sometime last year. I was seduced by the cover, which I can't physically show you because it hasn't yet arrived. The book is being released in Australia on the 14th of December. Riva Lera is an artist, writer and curator, and Golem Girl is an illustrated memoir. Writer David Mitchell has written this endorsement. Luminous, a profound portrait of the artist as a young and mature woman, an unflinching social history of disability over the last 6 decades, and a hymn to life, love, family, and spirit. I don't know if there's much more you'd desire in a book. And I can't go without mentioning the hugely exciting news that Ali Smith's companion piece is being released in April next year. I believe that my life will be one long suspension of breath until it is in my hands.
Great. Anything David Mitchell recommends, I'll read. Well, on that note, I think we have to wrap up. Just a reminder, everything we discussed tonight will come to you in an email, so rest easy, don't worry. We'll send you all the info. And I'm going to just hand over now to our festival director, Nicholas Brash, who I think is on standby to make a couple of announcements about future events. There he is.
Yeah. Thank you, Elissa, Tali and Bram. I'm in a state of shock. I've just realised I've read a book before Bram, and that never happens. So I've just finished Gigi Fenster's book, and I can also recommend as a psychological thriller over summer, a great read, and a psychological thriller unlike any other I've read. Not sure if that's the right description. I know it's been described like that, but it doesn't quite fit. It fits between 2 or 3 different genres. It's fascinating. So thank you anyway, Elissa, Tali and Bram, and I'm a bit annoyed at you all. I've got a pile of books to read next to my bed, almost as high as the ceiling, like most of you, but you've done nothing now but add to the load. So I don't know whether to thank you or to curse you, but I'll thank you for tonight and I'll curse you privately. Thank you very much. To everyone out there, don't forget, as Elissa just said, all subscribers to Melbourne Jewish Book Week newsletter will have a list of these books discussed tonight sent to them in the next few days. So don't worry if you've missed or forgotten a couple of them. And at this point, we come to the end of a very busy, eventful year at Melbourne Jewish Book Week and everywhere, of course. And I just want to thank all of the committee and the board members and our generous donors and sponsors, our panelists, our interviewers, our interviewees, and most importantly, all of you, our supporters, our audience. Next year, we have, oh my goodness, it's so good to say this, an in-person festival at last, fingers crossed. It's shaping up to be an absolute beauty, some very big names indeed. It's at the end of May. Before then, we have another online collaboration with Jewish Quarterly in February, and our first in-person event for 2 years in March. I don't want to take up your time now. I know you all want to go off, have something to eat, go to bed, whatever. So I'm not going to take up your time with the details, but you will receive details through our newsletter and our social media platforms. So please subscribe. Keep in touch, keep informed. Thanks again, Elissa, Tali and Bram, for ending the year in style and giving us plenty to think about again. And thank you all for your support this year. We value and we appreciate it greatly. Keep well and keep safe. Shalom.
Be well.
See you next year.